At the end of last summer, two friends and I decided to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and go camping by a quiet local lake, hoping to find peace and serenity in the embrace of nature. We set off in our car, filled with excitement for whatever adventures awaited us. The journey was full of laughter and music flowing from the radio, infusing the atmosphere with youthful hope and energy. When we finally arrived at the campsite, we eagerly set up our tents, driving the stakes into the ground and tightening the ropes meticulously, as if building a small sanctuary for ourselves in this vast world. As evening descended, we gathered around the glowing campfire, which added a magical touch to the atmosphere. We prepared a simple yet delicious meal, savoring the flavors while the lake's gentle breeze carried its scent to us. The night was perfect, filled with shared stories and funny memories as the flames flickered, casting strange shadows on our faces. We felt no sense of unease, only a deep calmness, yet the lake hid its secrets in its dark, still depths. In the middle of our cheerful conversations, our talk shifted to the lake's eerie tales. Some locals claimed that, despite its beauty, the lake was a tragic place where many had lost their lives, either by drowning or under mysterious circumstances. We discussed stories of people who believed the waters were deceiving, hiding beneath their surface tangled weeds and fallen tree limbs, like unseen hands ready to grasp any unsuspecting passerby. The lake bed, as they told us, was covered in thick layers of silt and mud that could easily entrap anyone. While we were discussing these unsettling tales, all three of us noticed something unusual across the lake. There were bright lights shimmering. At first, we didn't pay them much attention. There were other campsites scattered around the lake, and we assumed it was just another group of campers having fun. But something about those lights slowly drew our focus. As time passed, we realized that the lights were getting closer and brighter, moving towards us as if they were attracted to our presence for an unknown reason. We tried to keep our conversation going, pretending not to notice, but soon the lights became an undeniable mystery. They were growing larger, moving at a speed too fast to be rowboats, and we knew that motorboats were strictly prohibited on the lake. Suddenly, without any warning, the lights surged toward us, engulfing everything around us in an overwhelming radiance. Everywhere I looked, all I could see was light, enveloping us in a consuming brilliance. Those moments felt eternal, yet when we later calculated the time, the lights had only surrounded us for 3 seconds. Still, it was enough to completely distort our perception. When the light vanished, I noticed my friend had burned his fingers on his cigarette, which had burned all the way to the filter. There was no logical way a fresh cigarette could burn that quickly, and we realized that we had lost some unexplainable amount of time, like something had pulled us into another dimension. But the true terror started when my friend suddenly began screaming, utterly confused and unaware of what had happened. His cries echoed through the stillness, snapping us back into reality. Only then did I realize I was knee-deep in the water, while my friend was waist-deep, and our other friend was slowly wading further into the middle of the lake, as if in a trance. We screamed at him, trying to wake him up, but he didn't respond. The water felt heavy, as if it wanted to drag us down as we struggled to move. I felt the resistance of the lake, slowing my steps, and I had no choice but to swim, despite the filthy water entering my mouth. I managed to reach him first, slapping his back and shaking him until he snapped out of it. We exchanged shocked, bewildered looks, unable to comprehend what had happened. If my friend hadn't burned his cigarette, things could have ended tragically. The lake was deep, and with him already chest-deep, I shuddered at the thought of what might have happened had he kept walking. I still have nightmares of myself sinking deeper and deeper into the murky waters, unable to stop, as the light above grows dimmer until I'm swallowed by darkness. I now understand how dangerous that lake truly is. I have no idea what those lights were, something paranormal or extraterrestrial. I'll never know, and I have no intention of ever returning to that lake. We dragged ourselves out of the water, shivering from both fear and cold, quickly dried off, and packed our things into the car, as if fleeing from a monster. We left most of our belongings behind, desperate to escape that place. Nothing else happened, but that night remains etched in my mind as an unforgettable mystery that haunts me to this day. Last winter, I went on a camping trip with some of my work colleagues. The weather was cold, with the wind carrying a slight chill that reminded us of the harshness of the season, but our excitement overpowered any sense of cold or fear. The location we chose for our camping adventure was a piece of land owned by one of our colleagues' family members. This particular piece of land belonged to his late uncle, and ever since his passing, the land had been left untouched, allowing trees to grow wildly and thick grass to cover the ground, turning the area into a remote, almost forgotten wilderness. When we finally arrived, my colleague stood in awe, looking around as if flooded by old family memories. He remarked, surprised, "I didn't expect the terrain to be this rough." The area was rugged, with a winding river in front of us and a steep hill rising like a massive wall, while a dense, sprawling forest encircled us from every direction, as if swallowing the light and hiding secrets behind its towering trees. We felt completely isolated, as if we were in the middle of nowhere. We began setting up our tent near the riverbank, choosing a patch of land that had some gravel but was level enough for our needs. The river's gentle flow created a soothing, rhythmic sound, like nature's own music, offering a faint sense of calm. We lit a campfire, and the flames danced, casting flickering shadows on our faces, adding a mysterious and magical ambience to the surroundings. We shared a meal together, laughing and exchanging stories, feeling as though we had the world to ourselves. As the night deepened and the sky darkened, our laughter gradually quieted, and exhaustion began to set in for some of us. I was in the middle of telling a long story, my words drifting into the dark expanse of the forest, when I suddenly realized that no one was listening anymore. My friends had become silent and still, their attention fixed on something behind me. Their faces had turned tense, as though something had captured their complete attention. I followed their gazes cautiously and turned around slowly. Across the river, something was moving in the shadows. There, on the opposite bank, a dark silhouette emerged. It was the shape of a person, unmoving, as if carved from the very night itself. We had only the light of our campfire to illuminate our surroundings, making it impossible to see details, but a strange feeling crept over us, a sense of foreboding. The atmosphere shifted instantly, from the warmth of camaraderie to a tense, stifling fear, as if the shadows were closing in around us. Our friend, whose family owned the land, became visibly uneasy. This place belonged to his family, and no one was supposed to be there. Then, as if the shadowy figure had heard our hushed whispers, it began to retreat into the darkness. My colleague stood up, determination and worry etched across his face, and said, "I have to check this out." He squared his shoulders, trying to muster courage, and began to cross the old, rickety bridge that separated us from the other side of the river. The creaking would protest it under his weight as he made his way into the dark, telling us to stay by the fire. I couldn't help but feel anxious. If I had been in his place, I would have waited for a few minutes so we could discuss it together. But it was his land, and perhaps the drinks we had shared had given him a false sense of confidence. I silently wished him luck. We listened as his footsteps gradually faded away, leaving us surrounded by the soft whispers of nature. An uneasy feeling settled over us, making it impossible to regain the carefree atmosphere we had before seeing the silhouette. Moments passed, and then we heard footsteps returning. We thought it was him coming back, but the steps took an unexpected turn and drifted back into the woods. One of my colleagues shouted into the dark, "What are you doing?" "We're over here." But instead of a response, the footsteps turned into a sprint, rushing off into the forest. It was unsettling, and fear began to creep into our hearts as we wondered what was happening. Again, We heard footsteps approaching the camp. My grip tightened around an empty beer bottle I had picked up as an improvised weapon, prepared for the worst. But to our relief, it was our friend returning. His face looked pale and uneasy as he sat down and said, "I didn't find anyone. Maybe it was just shadows or a trick of the light." We told him about the footsteps we had heard, and his expression darkened with concern. Things were getting stranger by the moment. None of us wanted to be the first to admit we should leave, but the unease was clear on all our faces. We all felt the same creeping dread, though no one dared to speak it aloud. Then the forest erupted with more unsettling sounds. Footsteps, rocks being thrown, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. That was the final straw. There was definitely someone, or something, out there, and it was hostile. We quickly packed up our gear, our hands trembling, and left in a hurry. We never saw anyone, but whoever, or whatever, was there seemed to know the land far better than my colleague did. To this day, I don't know what was out there in the darkness, and I'm just glad we didn't stick around to find out. One winter night, my university professor shared with me a strange experience he had years ago, and when he finished telling the story, I was left stunned by the depth of the details and the oddity of the events. He recounted how he and a friend decided to go camping in a quiet village in Wakayama Prefecture, a place where nature's beauty and mystery seemed to call to those willing to explore. The land was surrounded by dense forests that stretched endlessly, with towering trees swaying in harmony with the gentle breeze. As the sun began to set, my professor and his friend managed to set up their tent near a riverbank, where the sound of the flowing water created a soothing, natural symphony, adding a magical aura to the place. They settled inside the tent, chatting and laughing, wrapped in heavy clothes to shield themselves from the cold. It seemed like the perfect night, with the peacefulness of rural Japan and a sky full of stars that twinkled from afar. Suddenly, his friend interrupted their conversation, saying, "Hey, can you hear that?" Both of them fell silent, and the sounds of nature around them became clearer. My professor then recognized a strange noise, like something being dragged on the ground, a heavy scraping sound coming from outside the tent. They exchanged puzzled glances before my professor cautiously opened a small flap of the tent and peered outside. The darkness was thick, and the surrounding forest loomed ominously, but there was nothing unusual to see. The area was empty, and the forest was silent. Yet, the dragging sound didn't stop. It continued, as if something was being dragged around the tent. Feeling uneasy, both of them stepped outside to investigate, lighting their lanterns and walking around the tent. But no one was there. The night remained quiet, and after a moment of uncertainty, they returned to the tent. The moment they did, however, the sound returned as well. It was strange, almost like footsteps, like someone dragging their feet while walking. It made both of them feel increasingly uncomfortable, so they decided to light the campfire and prepare dinner, hoping that some activity would ease their tension. But even as they ate, the eerie sound outside faded, giving them some relief. As the night deepened, they went back to their tent, hoping to get some sleep. The moment they lay down, the dragging sound started again. They discussed it, agreeing that it sounded like someone dragging something or possibly their feet. At this point, both were on edge, so they remained awake in their sleeping bags, trying to ignore the unsettling noise that seemed to circle around the tent. They checked outside numerous times, but saw nothing. It was unexplainable and terrifying. Eventually, they both tried to convince each other that it wasn't something to worry about, and they managed to fall asleep. The next morning, when they woke up, there was no strange noise. The peace of the morning made them think they had overreacted the previous night. They began packing their things, relieved that nothing else had happened. However, as they were packing up the tent, my professor noticed something unusual beneath it. There, in the dirt, lay a pair of old, weathered sandals. My professor, who was a local to the area, explained that a month before their camping trip, an elderly woman had drowned in the river nearby. He believed that the dragging sound they had heard was the spirit of the old woman, still searching for her lost sandals. This story happened many years ago during the autumn. My parents told me we were going camping, and I was allowed to bring a friend along. I couldn't wait. I knew it was going to be fun. So, when the weekend arrived, my parents, my friend, and I went off into the mountains for a camping trip. It was only for one night, but that was plenty for me. This was back when outdoor camping wasn't as popular as it is now. When we arrived at the campsite, we were surprised to see that there were no other campers in sight. Honestly, it felt a little lonely, but I soon forgot about that feeling since I was just a schoolboy, and I saw the campsite as our own private playground. We played by a nearby river and in the woods, and later that night, we had a campfire and a barbecue. It was really great. Just before bedtime, my friend's mood changed. Usually, he was full of self-confidence, but when the sun went down, his spirit dampened. He started to get homesick and frightened. Eventually, with tear-filled eyes, he told me he wanted to go home. By the time he said this, it was far too late. My parents had already had a drink, and we were getting ready for bed. We turned in for the night, with the sounds of the forest all around us. It was pretty spooky out there in the wild, but we managed to get to sleep without any issues. The next morning, we left for home. We had planned on spending a little longer at the campsite, but my friend was clearly in distress, so we headed home early. We left while it was still dark out. I can't remember exactly what time it was, but it felt like everyone just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. When we returned home, since it was the weekend, my parents went up to their bedroom to take a nap or something. Well, they said they were going to take a nap, but I heard a lot of banging around coming from upstairs. Anyway, it was still early in the morning, and I was pretty tired. I nodded off while sitting on the sofa watching morning cartoons. I woke up when the house phone rang. Back then, we didn't have caller ID displays on our phones, so I had no idea who was calling. I was hoping it would be my grandpa. My parents didn't seem to be coming downstairs to answer the call, and it just kept ringing and ringing, so I picked it up. "Oh, hey, good morning," I said. The voice belonged to some girl I didn't immediately recognize. Based on my recollection, I would say she sounded about my age, or perhaps it was an older woman with a youngish-sounding voice. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if it could be plausible, because I didn't think I'd given my home phone number to any of my classmates. I didn't say anything for a while. I just listened. Anyway, camping was fun last night. The barbecue was really great too. The shrimp were delicious. I had a good laugh when your friend, who's usually so cheeky and confident, started tearing up because he was homesick. I still didn't respond. I was still sleepy at the start of the call, but now I was starting to wake up. Something didn't feel right. I was starting to get a little scared. There were only 4 of us at that campsite. So how did this person know what we were doing out there? I couldn't answer that question on my own. So I asked the mysterious person on the other end of the line, "Who is this? How do you know what we were doing?" After some silence, possibly shocked silence, I got my answer. Not the answer I wanted or expected. The voice on the other end simply said, "Because we were together the entire time." And with that, I heard a click followed by the dial tone. I was really freaked out, but I instantly thought it might have been a prank by my friend. I called him immediately, but he said he hadn't told anyone about what happened at the campsite except his parents. He said he was so embarrassed about everything that he didn't even tell them about the part where he felt homesick. When my parents came downstairs after their nap, or whatever they were doing upstairs, I asked them if they had given anyone our number or told anyone about the camping trip. They said they hadn't told anyone or given out our number. The only person they had given our number to was the one who reserved the campsite for them. In the end, I guess, or maybe hope is the right word, it was just a prank and nothing more. But I have this strange feeling that we were being watched by someone that night in the woods. I can't forget the last words I heard on the phone, because we were together the entire time. It was during my elementary school days, on one of those hot summer days, when our school decided to organize a camping trip for the students. The trip was for 2 nights, and it was a great opportunity to enjoy the beauty of nature. The campsite was about 2 hours away from the nearest town, and it felt like we were on the brink of a new adventure in the wilderness. The place wasn't a luxury resort or anything fancy. It was more of a traditional camping spot. Although it was equipped with a kitchen and a bathroom, they were old and worn out. It wasn't like the scenes you see in adventure movies. The site reflected complete simplicity. The bathroom, in fact, resembled a basic outdoor toilet in a vast field. The campsite was located near a swamp on one side and a cliff on the other. While it was undeniably beautiful with its natural scenery, there was something about the location that gave me a sense of unease. Even as a child, I felt like it wasn't the safest place to camp, but that didn't stop me from enjoying the adventure. During the day, there were plenty of activities. We could go hiking in the mountains or try fishing in a nearby stream. But the most exciting part happened at night, when everyone gathered around the campfire and began the daring challenges set by the teachers. These challenges were a fun tradition, and we all looked forward to them. On the first night of camping, I decided to take part in one of these challenges. I thought it would be simple, just a little fun among friends. But as I soon found out, the challenges were more serious than I had expected. This particular test of courage had been set up by the teachers themselves. It required us to go into the woods at night without a flashlight, stay there for a while, and remain in complete silence. The rules were clear. If we ran or screamed, we would alert wild animals and become one of the missing kids of the area. Even now, I can't fully explain why I agreed to such a crazy challenge, but I guess I felt a mix of excitement and fear. The teachers led us through the dark forest. The atmosphere was strange. The only sounds I could hear were the buzzing of insects and the sighing of the trees in the wind. The darkness was so intense that I couldn't even see my own hand in front of me. We reached the designated spot, and the teachers turned off their flashlights, leaving me alone in the dark. I was supposed to be surrounded by other kids doing the same challenge, but I couldn't hear anyone. It was as if I was alone in a vast void. The air was thick and warm, clinging to my skin. I could hear the occasional rustling of bushes, and in the distance, an unknown animal was barking. I hoped it was far away, but it was hard to tell. In reality, I was probably out there for no longer than 5 minutes, but those few moments felt like hours. The darkness was suffocating, and I felt completely isolated. Then, out of nowhere, the flashlights appeared coming straight toward me. I was so relieved. The teachers were back, and I was no longer alone. We headed back to the campsite together, and the teachers joked about how we were lucky not to have seen anything strange. Everyone seemed lighthearted, and I felt a sense of bravery after the challenge. The rest of the night was uneventful, to be honest. The next day, I noticed that my friend, who had done the dare around the same time I did, looked very frightened. She kept staring at the cliff, and when I asked her what was wrong, she simply replied, "Can't you see them?" I was confused and followed her as she led me to the edge of the field near the cliff. She pointed down, but all I saw was a stream flowing below. However, my friend looked like she was on the verge of tears, and she was pointing at children with red faces, saying, "Can't you see them?" She was shouting and crying, clearly upset by whatever she thought she saw. The teachers came over to check on her and try to console her, but just like me, they couldn't see what she was talking about. I was worried about my friend, but life at the campsite continued, and as kids often do, we got distracted and eventually forgot about it. Later that night, I was very tired, but many of the other kids were still wide awake and full of energy. I was curled up in my sleeping bag, almost asleep, when I heard their excited whispers in the soft glow of the lantern. But just as I was about to fall asleep, the tone of their voices shifted from excitement to tension. I heard them whispering urgently, and when I poked my head out of my sleeping bag, I saw 2 girls leaning over another girl who was sitting on the floor. The girl on the floor was complaining of pain, saying, "It hurts." She looked as though something heavy was pressing on her back, and before our eyes, she seemed to fold in on herself, her chin almost touching the floor. She cried and screamed, and panic spread throughout the tent. The teachers rushed in, one of them holding a bottle of salt. They sprinkled it over her and started patting her back with their hands. Miraculously, she stopped crying, got up, and appeared as though nothing had happened. After that, nothing else out of the ordinary occurred, and we went home without further incident. On the bus ride home, I spoke with some of my friends and other kids from different groups about what had happened. Some of them had strange experiences too. One kid told me that when they went to the outhouse at night, they saw a kid they didn't recognize, standing completely still, staring at them. Other kids mentioned seeing shadows everywhere, humanoid shapes lurking in the dark. I was shocked to hear that there were more similar experiences. The mountains were certainly an unusual place. My friend, who had seen the kids with red faces, has developed a sort of fear of the mountains ever since that trip. Looking back, I can't even remember why I wanted to go on that trip. It feels like a distant, half-forgotten memory, like I was in some kind of liminal space between two worlds. This happened during my high school days when my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip deep inside the forest. The weather was refreshing at that time of year, and the sky was slowly darkening as evening began to set in. We had just finished dinner, which we had prepared over the campfire, and as we joked and laughed, the fresh air filled our lungs. But something unexpected was about to happen. As I bent down to grab some plates, I suddenly heard a deep thud. The sound was so loud that it made me stop moving for a moment. I quickly turned to my friends, and I saw that they had all stopped talking as well, their faces slowly changing expressions as if they had heard the same thing. "Did you guys hear that?" One of them asked in a low voice, trying to confirm what we had all just heard. "Yeah, it came from over here," replied another, pointing toward the area of dense darkness behind our tent. It was clear that everyone had felt the same fear. The sound had seemed like something heavy had fallen, maybe a huge animal or something else strange. We decided to investigate. The darkness had begun to envelop the forest around us, and the only light came from our flashlights as we made our way toward the source of the sound. Our hearts were racing with each step we took. Suddenly, on the ground, we saw something stretched out in an odd way. It was something white, and the beam of our flashlights illuminated it clearly. At first, we thought it was a large animal, maybe a prey or something else. But as we got closer, the shape of the creature became clearer in front of our eyes. The body strongly resembled a human, but it was positioned in a very strange way. We felt a deep confusion as we realized it wasn't moving. It was lying on the ground as if something heavy was pressing down on it. Its form was bizarre, and it seemed like a massive mannequin. "Oh my God," whispered one of my friends, panting heavily. "What is this thing?" Through the dim light of our flashlights, we began noticing more details. The hair was light and sparse, and the limbs were bent in an unnatural way, as if they were twisted at impossible angles. Our hands were trembling, and we all realized this wasn't something normal. "Is it a mannequin?" another friend asked, his voice shaky as he got even closer. "But how did it get here? Who put it here?" We searched around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest was silent. All we could hear was the sound of the wind and the rustling leaves. The darkness had completely taken over. We were deep inside the woods, far from any signs of human life. We had spent the entire day without seeing anyone else. One of our friends, who was braver than the rest of us, decided to stay on guard while the rest of us hurriedly packed up the camp. We had an eerie feeling that we weren't alone and that there was something we couldn't understand. We didn't want to stay any longer after discovering that strange creature. We quickly decided to leave, and although our hearts were racing, our minds were trying to process what had just happened. We chose to leave the place behind, leaving the creepy mannequin lying face down in the dirt, as if it were part of an inexplicable nightmare. When we reached a safe spot, we didn't talk about it right away. Everyone was lost in their thoughts about what had just happened and the strange thing we had found in the forest. But deep inside, we all knew something unusual had occurred. and those moments were forever etched in our memories. In that summer, when I was a child, my parents decided to take me on a camping trip with some close family friends. The trip was to a remote area, far from the noise of the city, where nature embraced the stillness, and the sky seemed to touch the earth. We chose a spot near a large lake surrounded by dense trees. The area was peaceful and secluded, like it was part of another world, far from everything else. We set up our tents next to the river and started preparing for a 2-day stay, eager to immerse ourselves in nature and escape the worries of daily life. As evening fell, we began to feel a sense of tranquility and started enjoying the fresh air and the scent of nature while my friends were chatting. But the atmosphere quickly changed when we began talking about daring each other to do some challenges. We were children, fearless and driven by curiosity, eager to try anything exciting. The conversation grew more animated until we heard the adults from the nearby tents. They overheard us and warned us not to take any dares at night, cautioning us about potential dangers. But, of course, nothing could stop us. As children, our decisions were driven by the thrill of the moment. The most exciting dare was to walk around the lake alone in the dark, without using any flashlights. The idea seemed crazy, but that's exactly what made it so thrilling. One of my friends, my closest companion, decided to go first. She was ready to face the darkness, while we watched her with hearts full of nervous anticipation. She disappeared into the thick dark, and we didn't hear anything for a while. But soon, she returned, and when I looked at her, I saw that her smile suggested she hadn't been frightened at all. Then it was my turn. My friend's eyes were fixed on me, and the pressure on my chest almost stopped my breath. I was incredibly nervous, but I knew I had to do it, especially after seeing my friend's courage. Finally, I took a deep breath and walked towards the lake. The darkness was overwhelming, and all I could hear were the sounds of nature around me. But suddenly, I started hearing footsteps approaching me, and my heart began to race. I stopped, bracing myself for whatever might be coming. At that moment, I saw someone approaching, carrying a flashlight. As they got closer, I realized it was one of my father's friends. I felt relieved because I knew him. He smiled at me, and as he reached me, he handed me something. It was a lemon candy. I thanked him and took it from him, but he whispered in a strange voice, "You should take it now." I told him I would keep it for later and slipped the candy into my pocket. He kept shining the flashlight in my face, but I couldn't clearly see his features as he had his hood up. Then, in an odd tone, he said, "Come with me." His voice didn't sound normal. I told him I needed to return to my tent, but something about his behavior felt off. This man had always been kind, and our families were having such a great time together on this trip. How could he be acting like this? I returned to my tent, where everyone had decided to rest. I was holding the candy in my hand, thinking about how I should thank him the next day. The next morning, as he was sitting and drinking his coffee, I walked over to him and thanked him for the candy. But what happened next was truly strange. He looked at me and said, "Lemon candy? What are you talking about? I didn't give you any candy." At first, I thought he was just teasing me or trying to trick me. But when I saw the seriousness in his face, I began to feel a deep sense of unease. He then told me that he hadn't been at the lake that night, which left me even more confused. My mother came out of the tent, having overheard our conversation. Her face was filled with concern, and I didn't know what to do. I returned to my tent and took out the lemon candy from my pocket to show everyone. All the adults and my friends looked at the candy with clear concern and fear on their faces. The situation was growing stranger by the minute. They all asked, "Who was that person you met at the lake?" At that moment, we all decided to leave as quickly as we could. As we packed up our things and prepared to leave, I felt a strange sense of dread, as though we had left something unexplained behind. We discarded the candy, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was still haunting us. It was like a bizarre nightmare that couldn't be explained, and it was something that would remain etched in our memories forever. It was the summer of 2009 when I decided to go fishing in a secluded spot. The area was nestled between steep hills and towering cliffs, giving it the feel of a place where no locals would pass through. The journey there was long and difficult, and I had assumed that I would encounter only a few people in this remote location. I had heard that the river there was home to large fish, the kind that fishing enthusiasts dream of catching. It was incredibly quiet, almost like a hidden refuge far from everything else. It was the weekend, and while I imagined I might run into a couple of other people, I was surprised to find that I was the only one there by the river's edge. It was a strange moment of solitude, one that felt oddly peaceful. After setting up my tent and arranging my campsite, I decided to prepare some food and relax for a while after a long journey. The atmosphere was so serene, it was as though time itself had stopped in this faraway place. After eating, I felt the need to rest, so I entered my tent and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, slipping into a deep slumber. The night had fallen, and I had planned to wake up early to start fishing at dawn. The night was very quiet, soft, and distant from the noise of the city. What I didn't know was that this night would reveal something to me that I was not prepared for. It was already past midnight when I suddenly heard a loud, strange noise. It was a sound I had never heard before, like something massive had crashed to the ground with a heavy thud. The shock was immediate. I woke up instantly, my eyes wide open, and for a moment, I felt as though I didn't know where I was. My mind was trapped somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, unable to grasp what was happening around me. The sound had stopped, but my tent was shaking violently, making me feel afraid. I looked around, my eyes darting anxiously. I glanced at my watch, and it was 2 a.m. I told myself in my half-asleep state to stay calm. Maybe this is that sleep paralysis I've heard about, I thought. It could just be an auditory hallucination, but the more I thought about it, the more real it felt. This didn't seem like sleep paralysis. I realized with a shudder that there might be another possibility. Perhaps a rock had fallen. I remembered checking the cliffs before setting up my tent, and I didn't recall any rocks. The ground had been hard and dry, but it wasn't impossible for a rock to have fallen. I didn't think it could be a person outside my tent in the middle of the night. That thought was too terrifying to consider in the darkness. So, I tried to reason with myself, considering all the possibilities. I knew that if I kept frightening myself, I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep. I switched on the light in my tent, which provided a small sense of relief, but I didn't feel like going outside to check the situation. I told myself not to worry. Morning would come soon, and I would be fishing, just as I had planned. But just as I was starting to calm down, I heard another sound. It was quiet at first, then it became more distinct. It was a groaning sound, as if someone were moaning or crying out in pain. At that moment, I felt as though I was going to faint from fear. As I lay there, the faint light of dawn began to appear, and I began to think that perhaps there was someone out there who needed help. I felt a strange sense of worry for whoever might be outside, so I decided to leave the tent. Just as I reached for the tent's zipper, the moaning grew louder. I froze for a moment, cold sweat running down my forehead. I could see something through the tent, the shadow of something outside. My heart began to race, and I was now certain that someone was out there. Fear gripped me, but I grabbed my flashlight and a frying pan as a weapon, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, was out there. I slowly unzipped the tent, looking around quickly. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. The place was empty, and in the distance, I could see a fishing boat, but that was all. I couldn't see the person or thing that had cast the shadow that had darkened my tent. It was eerily quiet, so silent that it was almost suffocating. I pulled back into the tent, still shaken. If you think about it, the tent was lit by the flashlight from the inside, so there was no logical reason why I should have seen a shadow outside. It didn't make sense. I turned on the radio to try to calm myself, my body still trembling as I sat inside the tent, trying not to think about what had just happened. After a while, I listened to the DJ's chatter between songs, slowly regaining some sense of composure. But then, without warning, the roof of the tent suddenly collapsed inward, crashing to the ground with a horrific noise. This time, I knew for certain it was no dream or hallucination. The roof of my tent was completely destroyed, and the impact hurt me badly as it came down. I felt utterly helpless, and I won't lie, I broke down. I started crying uncontrollably. I made a vow then and there to leave without doing any fishing as soon as the sun came up. The moaning continued outside, but now there was a new sound. It seemed like something heavy was dragging across the ground, or perhaps crawling. I don't know why, but I turned up the radio to its maximum volume. It felt like the only defense I had left. When daybreak finally arrived, it was like seeing a miracle. I was so relieved that the sun had risen and I could finally see everything around me. I quickly went outside and looked around the area. There were beer cans, bottles, and flowers scattered everywhere. I hurriedly began folding up the remnants of my ruined tent, but I stopped in my tracks when I noticed something strange. There was blood on the outside of the tent, as though someone had smeared it there. On the cliffs above, I noticed a path, perhaps an old road. I wondered if there had been an accident here. Maybe someone had died in this area. Perhaps, because of the nature of their death, they had become a vengeful spirit, tormenting anyone who camped here. I didn't know what to make of it, but I decided to offer the last of my juice as a gesture, a small offering to whatever spirit might be around. I wanted to believe that this was the only way to ease their troubled soul. The thought of a person or something out there messing with my tent in the middle of the night was simply too terrifying to consider. One day in the summer of 2009, I decided to embark on a new journey to capture photos of animals in their natural habitats. My job at a wildlife magazine required me to be in the heart of nature, far away from the noise of cities and daily life. This trip was unlike any I had taken before, as it led me to a very remote area where towering mountains and winding rivers made the place seem like a piece of another world. Reaching this area required a strenuous effort, as the path leading there was extremely isolated, and I was certain I wouldn't encounter anyone else during my trip. After several hours of walking, I finally arrived at a secluded swamp bank. The place was peaceful, and there were no signs of human presence. The sky was a clear blue, and the nature around me sang with the sounds of the wind and animals coming and going. After setting up my small tent by the edge of the swamp, I decided to take a short nap, as the day had been long. The usual routine on these trips was that I would sleep for a few hours in my small tent until sunset, then prepare to photograph some wildlife. But on this day, something unexpected awaited me. I woke up late, after the sun had already set, and darkness quickly enveloped the area. The only light breaking the stillness was the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the water's surface. I decided to hang my lantern from a nearby tree branch and began preparing my camera equipment. It was too late to photograph any animals, but I was still in a state of anticipation, hoping something special might appear during these quiet moments. Then, suddenly, as I was preparing to leave my tent, I saw something strange. About 10 meters away, in the darkness, there was a blue tent. It was extremely odd because this was not a place known for camping or any human activity. It was an abandoned, uninhabited area. I looked at it cautiously, but I had no logical explanation for its presence in such a remote place. Could there be someone else here? I had previously researched this area online and found no mention of any human presence. I decided to stay calm and continue preparing my equipment. Perhaps someone had set up their tent nearby, but I felt an odd sense of unease. I thought maybe I was hallucinating due to exhaustion, but when the blue tent suddenly lit up, a strange feeling rose in my gut. The tent flickered with unusual lights, and its color shifted unexpectedly. I felt worried and began to wonder if I should approach to find out what was going on, but I quickly dismissed the thought. I didn't want to get close to it. My heart began to race, and I felt uneasy. Maybe it was just my imagination, but something in that moment told me that something was wrong. Instead of approaching, I decided to move to another spot. I quietly began to dismantle my tent while keeping a close eye on the blue tent. I packed up my belongings and started hiking deeper into the mountains. I walked for a long distance, trying to distance myself from the strange tent. I wasn't thinking about photography anymore. I just wanted to get away. Eventually, I reached a high mountain peak and set up my tent again, but by then it was too late. The darkness had fully settled in. I decided to stay in my tent until morning. Hours passed, and the night was quieter than ever. I was in my tent, but I couldn't sleep. I felt an unusual warmth inside my sleeping bag, even though the weather was cold. I opened the zipper slightly to let in some fresh, cool air, but I was stunned to find the blue tent right in front of mine, as if it had moved closer without my noticing. When the lights inside it came on again, a shiver ran down my spine. Something wasn't right about all this. Then the unexpected happened. Hands pressed against the dirty fabric of the blue tent, as if someone inside was trying to push their way out. I froze in disbelief, but quickly snapped out of it, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it at the tent. What was happening in that moment was more than just ordinary fear. It was something real, something I couldn't ignore. I ran without daring to look back. The darkness surrounded me, and when I fell into the swamp, I felt the cold water soaking my body, but I didn't stop running. There was something in that tent that pushed me to flee, and fear consumed every part of me. I couldn't bear to think about what was in there, so I ran further and further, until I reached a spot far away. When I felt I couldn't run any longer, I hid behind a tree, trembling with fear. I waited anxiously for the dawn. When morning finally arrived, I decided to return to the spot where my tent had been to see what had happened. I called out loudly, hoping there would be a logical explanation for all of this. But everything was as it had been. The blue tent was still in place. I cautiously approached it, and when I looked inside, I was met with the biggest shock of my life. Inside the tent, there was a pile of bones. Human bones, animal bones, all mashed together in a random heap, as if the person or people inside the blue tent had left me a strange parting gift. A chill ran through my body, and in that moment, I knew I would never return to those mountains. I no longer ventured on solo trips deep into forests or mountains. That experience was more than I could bear. A few years ago, on a beautiful spring day, my friends and I decided to go camping in the Ibaraki area during our school vacation in May. The weather at that time was perfect, with clear skies and bright sunshine. I was with 3 of my friends, making a total of 4 men. 2 of them had been going to this camp every year, while the other was joining them for the first time, just like me. Even though I had never camped with them before, I was really excited to join this adventure. They had painted a very enticing picture of the trip, assuring me that the beach there was absolutely stunning. They also told me that the beach was usually quite empty, which meant that we could enjoy our time freely without being bothered by anyone. I was extremely excited as the trip promised a lot of tranquility and peace, far away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. After we left National Highway 51, we took a narrow road that passed through nearly deserted areas, making me feel like we were approaching a rare and untouched place. After a few hundred meters, we finally reached the beach, where we saw a family camper van parked near the entrance. We decided to set up our tent about 200 meters away from them, in a quieter spot. By lunchtime, the beach was full of people riding on surfboards, but by evening, everyone had started to leave. By nightfall, the beach was completely empty, except for the family camper van, which was still a few meters away from us. In the pitch darkness, the atmosphere was incredibly quiet, to the point where I quickly fell asleep in my tent. We had one shared tent. While 3 of my friends slept side by side, I slept in the corner at the bottom near their feet, a spot that felt somewhat like a cramped space. However, it didn't take long before strange feelings started to rise within me. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up with an urgent need to pee. The sensation was so strong that I felt like I couldn't wait any longer. I checked the time on my phone, and it was past 2 a.m. I wasn't the kind of person who was afraid of the dark or superstitious in any way. So I calmly got up and started making my way out of the tent, listening to the sound of the waves that calmed my nerves. But as I was on my way out, something caught my attention. It was another sound, strange, clear, and distinct, gradually drawing nearer. I stopped in my tracks inside my sleeping bag, straining my ears in the darkness. The sound was coming from no more than 5 meters away, and it sounded like footsteps moving slowly and heavily. At that moment, I thought it must be someone approaching. There was no external light, nor any signs of nearby campsites. The beach was isolated, and our tent was far from the family camper van. It started to worry me. Why would someone be out there so far from the rest of the camp at such a late hour? I tried to rationalize it, but something about it felt off. The sound continued to move around our tent, slowly circling it. The steps were deliberate but slow, drawing nearer and nearer. Then, I heard something else, a sound that seemed like it was touching the tent from the outside, something heavy pushing against the fabric as though testing for a weak spot. The metallic poles holding up the tent began to creak and bend, making a terrifying noise, as if they were under pressure from something outside. I was in a state of extreme tension, unable to think or move. I gripped my flashlight tightly in my hand, fighting the urge to run, but I couldn't move a muscle. The sound kept circling the tent, as if whatever it was trying to enter or break in. I wished for time to pass quickly, hoping that the nightmare would end. Then, suddenly, at some point when I must have dozed off, the sun began to rise. I woke up feeling an immense sense of relief, but I had no idea that something even more unsettling awaited me. I rushed outside quickly to relieve myself, forgetting all about the disturbing events of the previous night. But when I returned to the tent, I saw something strange. There were clear footprints on the ground, coming from the sea and leading right back to it. I was shocked beyond belief and immediately woke up my 3 friends to tell them what had happened. We decided to leave the beach as quickly as possible. The following night, we chose to stay in a more populated area, with many camper vans and tourists around. I felt much safer there, away from anything strange.